So, welcome to our Wild Ones Zoom meeting tonight. We are delighted to welcome Lauren Taylor, who is the Executive Director of the Blue Ridge PRISM, which serves a region slightly to our west, but since its founding has generously shared information and support on handling invasive plants with many other parts of Virginia, and is actively helping, I believe, some other prisms get started in the state, which will be also very helpful once they get up and running. The Blue Ridge PRISM stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. And they were founded in 2014 and have grown to encompass work beyond their region, including, among other things, educating land stewards, training volunteers, advocating for sound policy regarding invasive plants, and creating the Virginia Invasive Plant Coalition. Recently, Lauren Taylor, I think within the last couple of years, became the executive director of the PRISM and is taking it even further forward into the future. And Lauren graciously agreed to talk to us tonight about invasive plants, particularly in the context of our home gardens. What are we likely to encounter? What do we do how do we recognize them? Which ones should we be most concerned with, and so forth. So you didn't come here to listen to me, so I will turn it over to Lauren and we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you so much for this invitation. I am such a huge fan of Wild Ones and everything your organization stands for. So thank you so much for having me. And this presentation is a little bit different from some of the ones that we usually do because we are going to focus specifically on what you're seeing in your own landscaping. And I was given the information ahead of time that I don't have to spend a ton of time explaining to this audience why invasive plants are bad. You guys are already on that page, which is great. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I do feel, hang on, this was the, there we go. I feel compelled to start off with a story that is, for me, at least hot off the press. So I'm going to call this one a tale of tire treads. So you may recognize this grass. Fountain grass is a popular landscaping grass. It's low growing, about 3 to 4 feet high. And I started paying attention to it up in Northern Virginia during COVID in 2022. I was walking my dog through my dad's neighborhood and I saw these plants in bloom at the end of this person's driveway, really paying attention to the maroon scene heads. But what really got my attention is what was happening just immediately down the street line from the end of this driveway, which was this. And you can see, so none of these were planted. These are all spreading along the roadside. And that got my attention. I was doing a lot of volunteer invasive removal work at the time. And I said, this looks suspect. This doesn't look good. But the plant at that time was not on our Virginia invasive plant list. And so I kind of scratched my head and I said, well, maybe this is a fluke. And then about a week later, about 3-4 blocks away, I saw this along another street. And I thought, this is not looking good, but nobody seems to be concerned about this plant, at least not in this area. And then about 3 weeks after that, I was visiting the library in the center of McLean, and I was taking some photos of some kudzu in the woods, and I stumbled across this patch of fountain grass that was popping up there, and you can see it along the tree line. And I thought, okay, something is definitely up here. But in 2023, I moved back down to the Piedmont. I moved to Greene County. And again, it wasn't listed as an invasive plant. I wasn't seeing it anywhere in Greene County. And I thought, maybe this is just a fluke up in Fairfax County or something. And so to be honest, I forgot about it. Well, turns out that, what happened? There we go. In January 2024, the Department of Conservation and Recreation was presenting to the Virginia Invasive Species Working Group meeting, and this plant, fountain grass, was on their list of plants that they were putting through an assessment for the next go round of additions to our Virginia invasive species plant list. And at the time, they published this map from the Digital Atlas of the Virginia Flora, and you can see those blue dots, which is where fountain grass had herbarium samples that had been submitted. So these were the known locations at that time. Now, I didn't know this meeting was taking place. Fast forward to September of last year, when the new additions to the Virginia invasive species plant list came out. There were 13 additions made. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Fountain grass was one of them. And no sooner did that happen than all of a sudden, so the plant, it's very nondescript until it blooms. And then all of a sudden, with these dark purpley maroon seed heads, it just sort of jumps out at you. And so I saw an explosion of it up and down the highways, along the ditches, along the embankments, and the medians, all along the 29 corridor, the 33 corridor, out of what seemed like absolutely nowhere. And looking at the patterns on iNaturalist that we follow to see where people are reporting these things. So this map is no longer accurate. This plant is now being found in a number of the main corridors, highway corridors. But here's what's really problematic. And the reason I wanted to share this story with you is just in the last couple of weeks, we have been in conversation with a number of very large farmers in the Western Piedmont region, and fountain grass is invading their pastures and their hay fields, and it is destroying them. And so farmers are having to take entire fields out of rotation for multiple years. And if you can imagine the cost to a farmer of losing the productivity of large multi-hundred acre fields or pastures, losing all of that income, and then on top of that, having to pay to treat these plants to try to get rid of them. It's just, the economic damage is just unbelievable. And this is all happening so fast. So what it looks like is happening is a combination of VDOT mowing equipment, where they mow in a certain area, they pick up the seeds and they're spreading it, and also tire treads. So the original concentration was up in the Northern Virginia area. The seeds blow off, they get caught up in people's tires. People head out to the mountains for vacation. They come down the 29 corridor or down the 95 corridor. And the next thing you know, you have this plant popping up all over the place. So these things can move really, really fast. And I just wanted you to be aware. And I implore you, if you have this in your landscaping, please, at a minimum, cut the seed heads off when it blooms, or please try to remove the plant from your landscaping. The damage this is doing to our farmers is really astronomical. Okay, we're going to move on. So who is Blue Ridge PRISM? Sharon already mentioned. PRISM is an acronym for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. The generic term is Cooperative Weed Management Area. There are well over 100 cooperative weed management areas across the United States. Sometimes they're called PRISMs or CISMs or SISMAs, depending on what state you're in. They are always regional in nature. They're never statewide. If you were in New York, for example, every county in New York is covered by a network of 8 different PRISMs. And that's what we hope for Virginia, that eventually all of Virginia will be covered by a network of PRISMs. So we operate boots on the ground in 12 counties. We hope to pick up those last 2, Frederick and Shenandoah, that are kind of orphaned up there in the Northwest. 3.6 million acres, including surrounding 200,000 acres in Shenandoah National Park. But our educational work covers the entire state. We are, as Sharon mentioned, supporting the founding of new PRISMs. There is a nascent stage PRISM in the Northern Neck area, and they are operating as a, right now, the fiscal sponsor is their local Virginia Native Plant Society chapter. And there's a brand new PRISM formulating in Fairfax County. They're just going to operate in one county, and they're focused on tree rescue. And we're trying to get another PRISM started in Southwest Virginia. That one's taking a little bit longer, but again, we're working on support for getting PRISMs all over the state. Our core purpose is to improve the health of our natural world for future generations. That's why we get up and do what we do every morning. And we do that through educational presentations like this one, through tabling at various conferences and events, through site visits within our geography on properties 3 acres or more. We do online educational webinars. We do field training on the ground. We lead volunteer work days. We produce weed alerts, fact sheets, and so much more. And as Sharon mentioned, 2 Decembers ago, we gathered 85 different partner organizations from across the state, and we founded the Virginia Invasive Plant Coalition, which is currently being run as a program of Blue Ridge PRISM, and we hope at some point to be able to get the funding to spin this off and have it be its own 501c3 nonprofit. And on that website, you will find a number of resources, statewide resources, anything we can come across that can support you in your journey to mitigate invasive plants. We put there and also on the Blue Ridge PRISM website. So what are invasive species? I'm sure many of you are well versed in this, but I want to get us all on the same page because this is a controversial topic. It's something that people like to argue about, but for our purposes, when we talk about invasive species, we are referencing the legal definition. And most people don't realize there is a legal definition, Executive Order 13751 from 2016. And I'll read this just because the language is very, very important. So invasive species means with regard to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So this was an update to the original Executive Order 13112. And the addition in the language was the original executive order simply said human health. And when they updated it in 2016, they all added also the consideration for animal or plant health. So this is what we're talking about. So key number 1, for our purposes here in Virginia, the plant was not here pre-European contact. And key number 2, it causes harm, either economic harm, environmental harm, human, animal, or plant health. Common vectors of how these plants spread can be birds, wind, deer, dogs, shoes, tire treads, waterways, runoff, and as I just mentioned, mowing equipment and other means. And I also want to clarify what we're not talking about. So we are not talking about non-native plants that were brought here, escaped cultivation and naturalized, but they never form a monoculture that causes harm. So for example, dandelions, everybody loves to hate on dandelions. They may annoy you. You may not like them in your lawn, but they are not invasive. We're also not talking about native plants that when removed from the context of their natural ecology, they may spread quickly. But these plants, for example, the beautiful trumpet creeper, co-evolved with our native flora and fauna. And if you come across this in the wild, what you'll see is it actually plays very nicely with others. It's when you take it out of the wild, you let it grow in your yard and you let it grow on a structure like a fence or a house or some kind of building that it can be destructive. But in the wild, it cooperates very nicely in the ecological niche that it belongs in. So this is not an invasive plant either. So just really briefly, a little context goes a long way. There are roughly 400,000 species of plants on the planet that have been identified. Approximately 18,000 of those are native to the North American continent. Since 1492, humans have either intentionally or unintentionally brought over 30,000 new species onto this continent. And you can see the slope of the curve there. It's very much like the impact of human activity and climate. Out of those 30,000 species, approximately 5,000 have escaped cultivation, but not all of those are what we call invasive. So there's roughly 925 or so plants across the 50 states that have been identified as invasive. So which plants are invasive in Virginia and who gets to decide? It's not Blue Ridge PRISM. It's our Department of Conservation and Recreation. They create the list, and what we really want to emphasize with people is it takes years and years for a plant to get onto this list. No plant is on this list because we simply don't like them. It's not a willy-nilly decision. Plants go through a rigorous scientific protocol and assessment before they ever get onto this list. So if you see a plant on this list, what I tell people is it's really, really bad. So a lot of people see this and they, oh, I have that plant and I don't see it spreading, or I don't think this is bad. This can't possibly be invasive. It just means you haven't seen it where it is doing damage. So of the 103 plants, approximately 54 are what I would call a true weed species. In other words, no one is cultivating these plants, no one is growing them or selling them like Japanese stiltgrass, for example. But 49 of them are still cultivated and sold in garden centers or online. And that's because we have some language in our law in Virginia that says as long as a plant is considered commercially viable, for example, English ivy, someone can grow it and make money selling it, then we cannot ban it in the state of Virginia. And that is something that we are working on. So 13 species were just added in September. As I mentioned, the species listed on here in bold are ones that are available in commerce, and some of these may surprise you. I know I was a butterfly gardener way back when, and I loved my butterfly bushes, and I had absolutely no idea that at that time they had invasive tendencies or that they would actually become invasive. So that was a new addition to the list. Fountain grass we just talked about. Italian arum is another exotic that people have planted and is causing problems. Leatherleaf mahonia is another popular landscaping plant. Nandina, some of you may be surprised to learn, and ravenna grass and sweet autumn clematis. The others are more weed species. So let's talk about, now that we're on the same page, about what we mean when we say invasive plants. What are we likely to see in our yards? And I'm going to divide this up into intentionally planted and then unintentionally planted. So we'll talk about, maybe this is legacy landscaping that you inherited when you bought your property, or maybe you planted some of these not knowing that they were invasive. So we're going to work by habit, starting with trees. So the most commonly known one is the infamous Callery pear cultivar named Bradford pear. These were originally marketed as sterile cultivars. And by the way, don't be fooled. The industry has learned that people don't like Bradford pear anymore, and so they changed the name, and now they're calling them Cleveland pear. It's the same species. It's the same plant. It's just marketing. So these were sold as sterile cultivars. They cross-pollinated with other pear trees in orchards or in the wild. They regained their fertility, and the rest is history. So Albemarle County experimented with a bounty to give away native trees in exchange for people cutting down their Bradford pears. They exhausted the bounty supply in about 3 hours last year. So I think they're going to do it again. South Carolina initiated a very successful bounty program to get rid of the Bradford pears, and we hope to see more of that. Mimosa is a tree I remember from my childhood. We had one in our yard. Never dawned on me that this would become such a problem, particularly in the Western Piedmont area. We see this in the summertime all over the highways. So very popular landscaping plant. And it's really nondescript until those bright pink flowers and bloom. And then you can see these absolutely everywhere, and you realize how broad scale the situation is. Another intentionally planted tree is the Norway maple. These were very popular for quite some time. You can still buy these and plant these. The leaf looks very much like the native sugar maple. However, if you look at the base of the leaf, there's an extra 2 little notches at the bottom, and it has a very, very broad, wide span to it. Likewise, the samaras, or the little wing-like seed appendages, They are, so you have two seeds, like a pair of wings, and they're spread very far apart. All of our native maples hang down more like a V shape. So these seeds are very easy to recognize. The Norway species is really a bully tree when it gets into native parks and crowds out the others, and it's a prolific seeder. It just produces unbelievable numbers of seed each season. Royal Paulownia is one that you are about to see burst into bloom up and down the 64 corridor. I know the 29 corridor, we have it, has these lovely lavender, drapey sort of blossoms, giant heart-shaped leaves, very much reminiscent of our native catalpa. But the way that you can easily tell them apart is the catalpa has seed pods that hang down like giant vanilla beans. And the Royal Paulownia seeds, if you get up close to them, they almost look like little Pac-Mans. They have like a little open mouth to them, looks like the little Pac-Man character. White mulberry is another tree that's very problematic. We have a native red mulberry, and they can be really tricky to tell apart, particularly because the white mulberry is hybridizing with our red mulberry. So we're losing our native red mulberry stock. One of the ways that you can tell apart the mature trees is the red mulberry, which are getting harder and harder to find. The furrowed bark will have sort of a deep red in the crevices of the bark. So it's distinctive on a mature tree. But the leaf morphology is tricky. I have a hard time telling them on an immature tree, but what we're finding more and more is if you come across a mulberry, chances are it's probably a white mulberry and it needs to go. So also intentional in landscaping, there are some vines that have been really popular. Everybody loves Chinese or Japanese wisteria, the beautiful drapey purple flowers. These are a nightmare when they escape into the wild, and they are doing devastating damage to the trees up and down Central Virginia corridors. I don't know if you're seeing them as much on the roadsides in the Richmond area, but it's really tragic what we're seeing here. English ivy, I think, is probably one that everyone is most familiar with. I don't think anybody needs any help recognizing this. Oftentimes people think it's only problematic when it climbs trees and weighs them down and leads them to fall over in storms. But English ivy also creates a warm, moist microclimate in there that fosters mosquitoes and becomes a vector for the diseases like West Nile that the mosquitoes are carrying. Periwinkle is another. Now, periwinkle does not spread as far in the same way that some of the other vines where the birds eat the seeds and really deposit them a long way away. But it does spread primarily by root runners and rhizomes, but it does also spread a little bit by seed. I've seen it jump around in the forest and create dense patches, and it grows so densely that it prohibits any forest regeneration. What's fun though is when you remove a big patch in the forest and the seed bank that is just waiting for some sunlight to warm the ground will really start to come alive. But a lot of people don't realize that periwinkle is an invasive plant. Sweet autumn clematis, we have a lookalike that is very similar, our native virgin's bower. The way that you can tell them apart is the shape of the leaf. Our native clematis is, again, behaves very nicely out in the wild where it belongs. The sweet autumn clematis, on the other hand, when it escapes out into the wild, it climbs over everything and smothers the shrubs and trees underneath it. Winter creeper, boy, this one's personal to me. This is a ground cover that people love to plant as an alternative to vinca or ivy. The leaves look very, very much like vinca until you get up very close and you can tell that the leaves of winter creeper are serrated and the leaf margins of vinca are smooth. However, vinca doesn't climb trees, winter creeper does. winter creeper climbs trees so vigorously, it actually sends out branches that can be as thick and as strong as the original tree branches itself. So I've walked by entire trees of winter creeper that had a native tree underneath, and it was almost like a ghillie suit on the tree. You looked at it and you thought you were walking by a holly or something because they produce a berry, and you don't even realize that there's a poor native tree underneath there gasping for breath, and then the winter creeper will lay that tree down until a storm hits it and it will fall over. Some of the intentional landscaping shrubs, this is actually a pretty large category. The Amur honeysuckle, very popular landscaping shrub, multi-stemmed. It has a very distinctive vertical stripy bark. Once you see it, you really can't unsee it. This appears to have been removed from commerce in Virginia, but you still see legacy landscaping of this. And of course, it's escaping into the wild everywhere, but very, very common landscaping shrub. Again, the butterfly bush that everybody loves, and everyone is so sad to hear that this is now listed on our invasive plant list. So I want to bring up the topic of supposedly sterile cultivars, because the term in the landscaping industry doesn't mean what you think it means. So when I hear the term sterile, I think this is something that can't reproduce. But it turns out that in the landscaping industry, their definition of a sterile cultivar is 2% viable seed, 2% or less viable seed, and they're allowed to market that plant as a sterile cultivar under the current regs. A butterfly bush, one single butterfly bush in a season can produce 1 million seeds. Now, I'm no math genius, but I can whip out my calculator and tell you that 2% of a million is a really, really, really big number, and that's just one plant. So we're in conversation with the nursery industry right now because we feel very strongly that the term sterile cultivar is extremely misleading. If I'm in a store and I'm buying a plant that says it's sterile, I'm thinking it can't reproduce at all. And it turns out that that's just not the case. Chinese privet is a very popular landscaping shrub. You see this all over. This is one that the birds will eat the berries and they will absolutely distribute them far and wide. We have a tremendous problem out here with Chinese privet, which is just beginning to leaf out now in our Piedmont woodlands. Really, really problematic shrub. Japanese barberry is another really common landscaping shrub. Everybody loves this deep crimson color. Interestingly, when this escapes into the wild, it loses the burgundy color and it reverts to green until the fall, and then it will pick up some crimson color again. But it's really easy in the woods to just walk right by it because it's not this burgundy color. One of the dangers of Japanese barberry is that it creates a microclimate underneath the shrub that harbors the ticks that carry Lyme disease. So this is one of the plants that is causing harm to human and animal health. Japanese spirea is another pretty low-growing, seemingly nondescript shrub, popular for its pink flowers until it gets into the wild. Leatherleaf mahonia. I see this a lot in Fairfax County. I don't see it so much in landscaping down in this area. I think one of the reasons that people love this is it's evergreen and also it blooms in February. And I think it makes people happy that you see these yellow flowers on the shrubs in February in the dead of winter when nothing else is blooming. And then the flower heads drape down and produce these berries that become purple, and then the birds eat these and distribute them all over the place. The thorns on this, if you've never come across it, are wicked, wicked sharp. It's like the worst holly that you've ever seen. So getting this out of your garden takes a bit of a challenge where you have to sort of cut away at it very carefully to not get pricked by one of these thorns, and then dispose of those carefully and then dig it out. Nandina is a shrub that has become just ubiquitous in the landscaping. Everybody loves these red berries. As I like to say, as gardeners, we're fascinated with shiny red objects. Uh, you may have heard there's been a lot of news lately about the Nandina berries having a level of cyanide in them that is toxic to some species of birds, particularly our beloved cedar waxwings. This is a plant that sometimes, when I'm trying to connect with people about why invasive plants matter, uh, there's no one story that reaches everyone, but sometimes if you find out that people really love their songbirds or they care about our bird populations and but they love their Nandina, and then you let them know that the Nandinas are poisoning the birds, then oftentimes that will change their mind about invasive plants and they'll remove them from their landscape. At a bare minimum, we ask people please cut the seed heads off and bag and trash them. And this winged euonymus, otherwise known as burning bush, I'm going to guess that everybody knows this. I will tell you, in Charlottesville, Albemarle, Northern Virginia, this is one of the most popular landscaping shrubs I think I've ever seen in shopping centers, parking lots, people's yards. Everybody loves this sort of bright magenta purplish tone in the fall, makes everybody happy. And what a mess it creates out in our natural areas. Prolific cedar, this shrub. So intentional grasses include Chinese silvergrass. We're now seeing this all up and down the highways along 29, prolifically seeding. Again, we already talked about fountain grass. Golden bamboo. You may be aware that there are 3 counties in Virginia that have taken advantage of the new Virginia, or relatively new Virginia law, and enacted a bamboo ordinance where you can't make somebody get rid of their bamboo, but you can require that they mitigate their bamboo and keep it from running into your property, or you can report them and they can get fined for not managing their bamboo or putting in a bamboo barrier. So that's Fairfax and Fauquier and Stafford counties. And Loudoun County is looking at doing the same thing because they have such a problem with the bamboo there. Ravenna grass, this is kind of a wimpy looking Ravenna grass. They're usually more robust, but I couldn't find a licensable or a license-free image to show you. But if you've ever traveled down south or out west, people love to landscape with the Argentinian pampas grass with its big fluffy plumes. The pampas grass doesn't do that well this far north, has a hard time surviving the winters. But Ravenna grass, which looks a lot like it when it's robust and it's strikingly tall, it can be 12 to 13 feet tall. The Ravenna grass will survive our winters up here. And so it's become a very popular landscaping plant for that reason and is now escaping. This is another new addition to the Virginia list. So some of the intentional forbs that you'll see, this is beefsteak plant, otherwise called Korean mint or perilla. I deliberately showed you a picture of it reverts to green when it escapes cultivation. Usually when people buy it and put it in their gardens, it's a deep purple, almost like a purple basil color. But you wouldn't recognize it necessarily if you saw this out in the wild. But if you've got that beefsteak plant, it is a tremendous spreader. Italian arum, I mentioned earlier, is one of the new additions. This, very sadly, is a beast of a plant to get rid of. It has tubers and rhizomes that go deep and wide, and it's particularly a problem in the Pacific Northwest, where they are discovering huge patches of it in their sort of rainforesty areas, and they have not been able to figure out how to kill it. They've been experimenting with cocktails of various herbicides. No one herbicide has been able to take it out, and it's doing tremendous damage in the forests there. So what we say is if you see an isolated population of this, like a little patch crops up in your yard, you need to dig way wider around the base of the plant than you think you need to and dig deep underneath it, pick up the whole clump, the whole big ball of soil, and put it in a trash bag and bag it and dispose of it. If you miss the tiniest little fragment of a tuber or rhizome, it will come roaring back. And that's another one that, at a bare minimum, cut those red, shiny red seed heads off. Yellow flag iris is still for sale in commerce. This is sort of a pond plant that people like to put in marshy areas or fish pond areas, and then it spreads and takes over everything. So those are the things that are really commonly planted in landscaping. You may have inherited some, you may have planted some, and then we're going to talk briefly about what are the unintentional invaders that you may see in a suburban or urban landscape. So the main tree will be the tree of heaven. Many of you are probably familiar with this. This was sold commercially until not that long ago, and it's now on our noxious weed list, which are the plants in Virginia that are illegal to sell. And usually plants get onto the noxious weed list when they've caused so much damage to agriculture that that they're then banned from being grown, sold, traded, moved, or transported into the state. So this is a very large mature one on the right. A mature female tree of heaven can produce over 300,000 seeds in one season. You'll see these all along the highway corridors. If you live anywhere near a major street corridor, you may have this encroaching in your yard. The unintentional invader vines, there are about 6 of these that you need to worry about for your trees and your shrubs. So clockwise from the top left, cinnamon vine is the heart-shaped leaf on the left. And then I think most people are familiar with Japanese honeysuckle, top center. That's a close-up of kudzu in the top right. Most everyone knows of this as the vine that ate the South. Beneath it is what we're calling the vine that ate the North, which is the ornamental porcelain berry that was originally brought here for its jewel tone berries and is now doing as much damage as kudzu, but really starting from this area and heading way up into the north. And then the middle photo on the lower row is an autumn picture of Oriental, or now called Asiatic, bittersweet. And there is an American bittersweet, but I have yet to ever see it. So my guess is you probably won't either. If you come across this and there's some subtle ways to tell the difference, well, you're probably looking at an Oriental bittersweet. One of the vectors for this is that people loved the berries and they made autumn wreaths, decorations. They hung them on their doors, and at the end of the season, they tossed them out into their yards or out into the woods. And we had explosions of bittersweet vines, and in the last 3 years, it has just really gone crazy. This is one of the species we're going to talk about, what we call 5-alarm fire species, and Oriental bittersweet is one of those. And the last photo in the lower left is what's called mile a minute. This is a distinctive plant. You see it has almost a perfect triangular shaped leaf. There is nothing like it in the Virginia flora. So if you come across something with a triangular leaf, you're looking at mile a minute, and it grows a mile a minute. That's how it got its name. It is an annual, so it will die back to a thatch. It has tiny little wicked, wicked barbs. So if you do come across this, please wear gloves when you're handling it. If you have a large infestation, you can use a rake and pull it out, but it is a tough one to get a hold of. So unintentional shrub invaders, the 4 primary ones I wanted to talk about: Japanese knotweed in the upper left. That's another 5-alarm fire species. We'll circle back to that topic. In the upper right is the linden arrowwood. Again, we love our shiny red objects. This plant was in commerce until not that long ago, and now I can't find it in commerce in Virginia anymore, thankfully. It has crowded out our beautiful native southern arrowwoods, which don't have fancy red berries on them, but are much more important for our bird populations. Below that is wineberry, and next to that is multiflora rose in the lower left-hand corner. And we're going to come back to some identifying features as well. 2 primary unintentional grasses. Almost everyone is dealing with Japanese stilt grass. This came here as packing material, was unintentionally introduced. and now we have a problem with it across half the continent. It has a very distinctive, slightly off center, silvery stripe down the middle, makes it very easy to identify. And it's an annual, it's very, very easy to hand pull, but it's a prolific seeder. One plant can produce 1,500 seeds in a season, and timing is really important. The one on the right is called carpet grass, and I'll show you a picture in a moment of how you can identify that. That one likes to grow in like ditch areas and lawns, needs a little bit of a moisture area, part shade. So unintentional forbs. The upper left, we have Asiatic dayflower, and then chickweed, which is coming out right now. Garlic mustard, which will be the basil rosettes, are visible now, and next month they will bolt up and flower. Creeping Charlie, or gill over the ground in the upper right. This is really a common, what I call a lawn weed, but it makes huge patches when it gets out into the woods. This is a really tough one to get out of your garden beds or out of your lawn. And then persicaria, or smartweed, or jumpweed, jump seed, sometimes it's called, down below in the lower right with the pink flowers. Next to it, the yellow flowers, is lesser celandine, is another one of our 5-alarm fire species. And then we have ivy leaf speedwell, and the last one on the left is incised fumewort, which is another 5-alarm fire species. So these are all plants that are not cultivated. They're just unwanted intruders, very, very common in suburban landscapes. The lesser celandine in particular will follow ditches and wet or shady lawns and take over absolutely everything. So now that we know the different plants that we might be there, how do we identify these? So I recommend a 3-step process. And the first is to get yourself a good plant ID app if you don't have one already. I like Picture This. Most of the people I know like Picture This. It tends to have the highest accuracy rate of all of the apps out there. And I did, after a couple of years, break down and get the paid version. And then I kicked myself and said, why did I wait so long? I use this every day. I am constantly on Picture This. It's a really great tool. Second, so Picture This is going to give you a good sense of what you might be looking at. And then on our website last year, we released a invasive plant ID and control app. And so it's not an app that you have to go to the App Store and download. It's just a page on our website that's built on a database table. And it has all 103 plants in there and photo essays. It has the control methods and the timing. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for everything you need to know about that particular plant. And then it also has side-by-side photos if there happens to be a look-alike. For example, with the wisterias, we do have an American wisteria that's native to the southeast corner of the state. So we'll give you side-by-side leaves, side-by-side flowers, side-by-side bark, etc., to help you tell the difference if there is a look-alike. Then I recommend, as a final step, getting the Flora of Virginia app, which is like the giant coffee table book, but with photos and lots of bonus information. So that is really helpful as well. So that's sort of my 1, 2, 3 steps in terms of getting a positive ID on any plant, really, but in particular, an invasive plant. So I'll just give you a quick little example here of one. Marsh marigold is a similar lookalike to the invasive lesser celandine. In many ways, they resemble each other. You bloom about the same time. The leaves are similar in shape. There's a different number of petals, but even that can be a little bit confusing. But here's the telltale note. Lesser celandine has sepals when you turn the flower over, and the marsh marigold does not. So what I find for most of the invasive plants is there's some distinguishing feature. If you just learn what that is, then you can very, very easily get yourself a positive ID. And those are some of the things that we point out in the app that we created. So distinguishing features of tree of heaven, for example, um, these long fronds with opposite leaves, there are many, not many, but there are a handful of natives like sumac and black walnut that are similar. But the distinguishing feature on the tree of heaven is that it has these little notches, or what I call thumbs, at the base of each leaf. There are little glands on the back side of that. And nothing else in the Virginia flora has that. So the moment you see those little thumbs, you know that you're looking at tree of heaven, whether the tree is in bloom or not. The multiflora rose has two distinguishing features. It has these backward bending cat claw thorns, but also a really distinctive feature is a hairy stipule. So none of the other rose species have this little hairy stipule where the leaf connects to the stem. And I mentioned earlier the carpet grass. So on the left is our native deer tongue grass, which has a clasping leaf. So you can see that the leaf joins the stem, but doesn't wrap all the way around it. The invasive carpet grass, on the other hand, has what's called a perfoliate leaf, where the stem actually comes right up through the leaf. So the leaf wraps all the way around that. So that's one way to tell that plant apart. So again, distinguishing features, we're looking at flowers, leaves, petioles, bark, seed pods, fruits, roots, and rhizomes. Some plants, for example, Japanese barberry, you cut into it and it's bright yellow. It's just a shocking, almost a chartreuse yellow color, the wood underneath the bark. Oriental bittersweet, for example, when you pull that out, has bright orange roots like carrots. Leaf buds and leaf scars. So tree of heaven, when the leaves on the small saplings come off, the leaf scar along the stem is shaped like a little heart. So again, lots of different defining features that make it really easy to help you get a positive ID. And another guide, this is available as a free digital download, is the Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas. If you Google this, you can get the whole PDF and just download it for free. And this is a very valuable guide as well. So how do I prioritize? So there's a couple different ways, but the first thing we're going to say is to take a top-down approach. And what do we mean by that? So we're going to start with rescuing the trees. So if you have trees that have vines climbing up them, not our native vines, but if you have vines that are strangling your trees like a boa constrictor, or smothering them like English ivy or winter creeper, we want you to rescue your trees first. We can plant trees until the cows come home. We cannot replace the carbon sequestration of these mature trees. You know, it takes 100 years or 80 years or something for the plants, the trees that we're planting today, to catch up to those. We need to preserve our tree canopy as best we possibly can. And after that, we look at removing the shrub layer. And after that, the forbs and grasses, and then clearing the ground. So if you just remember, think of taking a top-down approach. That's a good start based on what you have on your property. Another way to think about this or look at it, so now you're going to choose, remember, timing is everything. So different times of year are appropriate for different species. And so let's say today's the day that you want to go and you want to work on a garlic mustard infestation on your property. So when you're focused on a particular species, one of the not so intuitive concepts is to work from best to worst. So the outer circle only has 3 plants in it. And so your focus there is to start there and eliminate those 3. When you do that, you're preventing those from spreading. And what you're also doing is you're clearing the maximum amount of square footage. That's how I remember it. So you get bang for the buck by pulling out those 3 in the outer area. And then you move to the next circle where you have some scattered plants. And what you're doing there is your goal is to control those by removing them, keep the advancing threat. And you're going to leave that core, that hot mess, in the middle until you have time or resources. And your goal for that is to just contain it. So work your way outward in. And in the beginning, I had a hard time thinking about this. I wanted to just dive into the big messes. And then once I wrapped my arms around this, if I just focus on clearing maximum square footage, you expend less energy and create more usable space for restoration. If you have limited time, resources, and energy, if you just remember 3 things, save the tree canopy first. That's an Oriental bittersweet vine that's strangling that tree over on the right-hand side depicted. And then if that's all you can do, if you've got a little more time, try to prevent the next crop of seeds. If you have an invasive plant and you don't have the ability to remove it from your property or treat it, just try to cut the seed heads off, bag them and trash them, and at least you'll prevent the spread. And then beyond that, if you have time, resources, or energy, remove, reduce, or contain what you can. We all have constrained resources, and so this is another way of thinking about how to prioritize your work. So step 1, tree rescue. These are all the vines that may strangle your trees: a good pair of loppers, a good pair of clippers, always gloves. These are what some of the trees look like. This winter creeper heading up on the left, wisteria in the middle, and Oriental bittersweet on the right that strangle the trees and damage the cambium layer, cutting off the flow of nutrients. And so you want to cut those as quickly as possible. So this is some more views of vines that are killing the trees. And the process we talk about is what we call the window treatment, where you're cutting a gap in those vines and cutting off the flow of nutrients upward. Those will eventually die back and fall off on their own. And then we recommend a cut stump method of treatment, where you dab just the tiniest amount of herbicide on the cut stems, which will translocate down just into the roots so that that vine will not come back. Big warning here: do not pull vines out of the trees. This is a good way to injure yourself, and it's a good way to injure or kill the tree. You don't know what those vines are attached to, and you also don't know what is the health of the limbs up above. And so a limb might be weakened and you give a tug on the vine, and the next thing you know, the limb has come down and hit you in the head and knocked you out, or caused more damage than that. Or you've pulled the bark off the tree, and now the tree has a threatening injury that may not be life-sustaining. So the next step is we want you to be on the lookout for EDRR, or early detection rapid response species. This is a brand new threat, Trappa, two-horned water chestnut, two-horned Trappa. So these are the 8 that I want you to be looking for. So Italian arum, Kogan grass. This is an aquatic plant, the water chestnut, the two-horned Trappa, and then the Ravenna grass, butterfly bush, leatherleaf mahonia, incised fumewort is just about to bloom now in our woods, and then the fountain grass. So these are all newly added species to our invasive plant list, and they are still in tiny pocket populations where we actually potentially have the ability to eradicate them. We're very careful about using the word eradicate, and we only do that when there are small isolated populations. Once it really gets out there in the wild, we no longer talk about eradicating. We talk about controlling and trying to maintain and trying to figure out how do we live with this beast. But it becomes cost prohibitive to try to figure out how to actually eradicate. So the faster you can jump on these, the better. Now, you've heard me say 5-alarm fire species. So we have 6 species that we are paying particular attention to. The reason we're calling them 5-alarm fire species is because, for one reason or another, either they're a new invasive like the two-horned Trappa with explosive growth patterns, Or they're a sleeper species like the Japanese knotweed in the top center. That species was brought here in the 1880s as an ornamental. And for some reason or another, and we don't really understand why, it existed just fine in gardens. And at some point, it escaped cultivation, and now it is spreading explosively up the mid-Atlantic and into New England and into Canada. And wherever it goes, it takes over entire watersheds, crowds out everything. If you live in the UK and you have Japanese knotweed on your property, you cannot get a mortgage. It becomes very hard to sell your house. So Japanese knotweed and Kogan grass worldwide are considered the #1 and #2 worst invasive plants. Japanese knotweed will grow through lava, it will grow through brick, it will grow through concrete, it will destroy your sewer, it will grow through the foundation of your house, sends out rhizomes 50 feet in all directions. So this is just one really mean and nasty plant. The incised fumort is a relatively new arrival, but we are seeing absolutely explosive growth in wetland areas and stream banks, along with the lesser celandine, which has been here for longer, but will take over entire areas. So what happens with these plants, they get into a natural area, they have the ability to explode in growth almost seemingly overnight, and then they change or alter the ecology of an entire area. So the Japanese knotweed just wipes out absolutely everything else. We're seeing the same thing with the bittersweet and the wavy leaf grass in the lower right corner. And so what I will say to you is if you see any one of these 6 on your property, you definitely want to make a plan to treat that as soon as it is practicable by the right timing for that particular plant. Don't let these plants go or get ahead of you. So you've taken care of your trees, you've kept an eye out for early detection, rapid response species, you've determined that you don't have any 5-alarm fire species, or if you do, you've mitigated them. And now you want to look at your shrub layer. So these are all some of the invasive shrubs that you might find on your property. And then lastly, you're going to look at the forbs and the grasses and clearing the ground, which will allow for reforestation and seeds to germinate. So I want to talk a little bit about favorite tools. I do not understand where these red marks are coming from on the screen. It's like there's a ghost and someone's drawing on the screen. So forgive me for that. I have no idea how that's happening. So favorite tools. So this is your basic gear. Always a good idea to wear safety glasses, particularly if you're working with vines or doing anything overhead. Highly recommend that you get a good pair of double palm leather gloves, especially if you're working with anything thorny. I like to wear wellies because when I am on a wooded property, it makes me a little bit fearless about accidentally running into snakes or anything else. So I like to, and plus it makes the really hard for ticks to climb up on those. So good tick prevention. Always wear a hat, a good pair of hand clippers, and my Hori Hori knife is one of my favorite tools. Best $18 on Amazon I think I've ever spent. And then there are some extras depending upon what species you have on your property. So you might want a rake for some vines. You might want loppers if you have shrubs. If you're doing hack and squirt on some trees, you might need an axe, and you might want some shears if you're doing any hedge related work. And then handy equipment is also a tarp to toss refuse onto. Some of the plants you can just leave them to dry out in the sun. Some of them you need to bag and compost or trash. And if you have a larger property, you might want a pulling sled. Those can really come in handy, make your life a whole lot easier. My very favorite tool, aside from my Hori Hori knife, is something called a Nomad. That's the brand name. Root Slayer shovel. So they make different, Root Slayer is the brand name. Nomad is the model that I like. They make a bigger model. This particular one only weighs just over 2 pounds. So it's really easy to tote around and not tire yourself out. It has a very, very sharp blade at the bottom that is designed to cut right through the roots of shrubs. And then you can see it has serrated edges like saw blades. So this is not a shovel that you're going to use to plant anything because it doesn't bring up a lot of soil, but it will make absolutely short work of digging up shrubs and other things. And you don't tire out when you're carrying it around or using it. Great investment. If you have a lot of shrubs that are single trunk or small saplings, an uprooter or a polar bear is a wonderful investment. This is an expensive tool. However, they can be shared. The jaws will open to about 2 inches wide. You place those right around the base, and then it's a very heavy tool, and all you have to do is lean back. It just uses physics. And so once the jaws clamp down on that and you just push back on it, it just pulls it right out of the ground. So no digging, just using lever. And there are 2 brands, uprooter and polar bear. Happen to have used the uprooter. Really nice to have around if you have those plants on your property that require that. Another tool is the honeysuckle popper. The difference with this, so the uprooter will only wrap itself around one trunk, but let's say you have a multi-trunk shrub, becomes difficult to use an uprooter on that. Oftentimes these invasive shrubs are very shallowly rooted, and so with the honeysuckle popper, you take that metal point at the bottom, you get it right up to the base of the shrub, and then the same principle of physics, you just lean back on it and it'll pop the shrub right out of the ground, saving you a lot of work. I had to cut down quite a bit of bamboo on my father's property, and I invested in a battery powered pole saw to take out and do that with. And it made my life so much easier. This is one of my other very, very favorite tools, partial to the Ego brand after reading a bunch of reviews. And this is a multi-head tool. So the next thing that I invested in was the articulating hedge trimmer. So on some properties where you end up with a wall of vines, a pole saw or a chainsaw won't grip those vines because they're too spindly, but the hedge trimmer will slice right through them. And so what's articulating about that hedge trimmer on the pole is the blade will actually rotate to a 90-degree angle. So it can either be straight out or it can bend, so you can sweep it along the ground or raise it overhead. It's a pretty great tool, again, only for those sort of specific circumstances. So manual and mechanical methods of control. You will hear us talk about pulling, grubbing, raking, cutting, mowing, string trimming, scalping, digging, and uprooting. And this is what those look like. Hand pulling is pretty self-explanatory. Grubbing with the mattock, raking aquatic species or vines, cutting with the loppers or mowing. Scalping is pictured in the lower left corner. What we mean by that is some species you want to take your string trimmer and turn it at a 90-degree angle, and you're actually slicing down into the dirt and cutting the stem off closer to the roots. So that's a good way to treat Japanese stiltgrass, to make sure you get all the seeds that are hiding down in there. And then of course, just digging and using a uprooter or polar bear. So these are some of the mechanical methods. I'm not going to talk about herbicides on this because we don't have enough time to go into all of that, but we have plenty of information about when you might need to use herbicides or what herbicides or where to get herbicides. We have all of that on our website. And we have more information on how to control manual, mechanical, biological methods. The Department of Forestry chart gives you some timing by different types of habits. And coming soon, I think you'll be excited to see this. So we're about to release a big spreadsheet that helps you create, if you have a larger property and a lot of different species to deal with. Again, timing is everything. We've created a spreadsheet listing all 103 species and the best timing for the best method. It's color coded to show you when it's leafing out, when it's blooming, when it's setting seed, because some plants you can use different methods depending on the time of year and depending on what stage the plant is at. So in the legend, it codes the different types of methods and what month is best for the method. And then if there is a chemical that's recommended, we put that in the notes on the right-hand side. But a lot of these you can do with just manual or mechanical methods. So we're about to release this on your website. It will be in a form where you can take the spreadsheet and make a copy of it and create your own, eliminate the plants that you don't have on your property, and then you'll just be left with your own custom version of our recommendations for timing and control. So I'd be remiss if I didn't quickly say, what more can you do to help? Educate and organize your neighbors and your friends. You can create a community guide using iNaturalist and record where you're finding evidence of invasive plants in your neighborhood, and stop it at the source, please. Just say no to these invasive plants that are in commerce. Volunteer for nursery surveys. We're about to launch this spring the first statewide nursery survey of who and where are selling invasive plants. And sign and share the petition if you haven't already. We're starting with the 800-pound gorilla in the nursery industry, and we're asking Home Depot to stop selling invasive plants. And I think Wild Ones is probably pretty familiar with this quote, but this is one of my very, very favorite quotes from E.O. Wilson. There can be no purpose more inspiring than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us. And I'll leave you with the thought that we can all play a role in reversing the spread of invasive plants. And I thank you. I would love to take questions and answers.
All right, we have run slightly over, but if you are still willing to take some questions, we did have a couple in the chat. One question was whether there are species that we should not burn if we are trying to dispose of them and we can't just leave them to dry out on the ground. Obviously, you know, some plants like poison ivy, which is a native, but they tell you not to burn it. Are there other species that we should be careful about?
The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is don't burn bamboo. Bamboo has air chambers between the nodes, and if you burn it, it will sound like fireworks going off. It'll sound like a machine gun, and you will scare the dickens out of yourself and your neighbors, and somebody might call the cops.
Okay. Another of the questions was if you have a mature infestation of Oriental bittersweet, should you cut that the same way you would approach cutting English ivy, or should you cut it and treat it in something more like multiple sections?
You can do it the same way. You're going to cut a window or cut the vine off so that what's up top is removed from its source. And then with Oriental bittersweet, you're going to do a cut stump treatment with herbicide. So English ivy, you can actually, if you're diligent, you can actually pull it out of the ground. You don't have to use an herbicide. People do if they have a really large infestation. But Oriental bittersweet, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting rid of that without using an herbicide on that little slice of cut stump.
Okay. And then another question was, are you guys at the PRISM watching any species of concern that haven't yet made it to the list?
Yes. Gosh, I should know those off the top of my head. I'm drawing a blank right at the moment, but we get notices from our colleague PRISM, the National Capital PRISM. Sarah Tangren runs that, and they send out messages for things that they're keeping an eye on. I know there's something called blackberry lily that they're watching up there. And then we also get messages from Judy Fulton up in Maryland, and we see what they're watching there. And then we pay attention to plants that are coming up from the south. So we have things both that are working their way downward and things that are working their way upward. And when I remember what some of the other ones are, I'll shoot you an email, Sharon, and you can share them.
Wonderful, thank you. And another question, and then maybe we will stop there. Well, two, actually. One's quick. Tree of Heaven,
Mhm.
if you burn it, does that actually make it grow back worse? Do you know?
Well, so Tree of Heaven is a sneaky plant that if you just cut it down, it will go into emergency mode and it will send up root suckers, and you'll have a much worse problem than what you started with. So what we recommend with Tree of Heaven is you have to trick the tree into not realizing that it's dying, and you do that by a process called hack and squirt. So we have entire webinars on how to do that. But basically, that's where you take an axe and you cut little divots into the bark going around in a circle, and you spray a tiny little amount of herbicide in there. So the tree is going to die very slowly, and that will not trigger the emergency response.
Oh.
After the tree is dead, then you can burn it.
Ah, okay, good to know. Thank you. And then finally, a question we're all kind of wondering, I think, is assuming that the governor signs the recently passed bill about labeling or identifying invasive plants in nurseries, do you think it's really going to help much?
So it's a baby step. As our legislative consultant said to us, policy is all about accomplish what you can accomplish today and then use that to build on and accomplish more in the future. So our end game is to get these plants banned from commerce. We knew, given the current administration, we were not going to be able to make the leap from right now. We have language in the law that says it's legal to that. So this is a baby step in that direction. Is it going to solve the problem? Absolutely not. You know, there are a lot of challenges with this legislation, but we want to advance it the next step. And then we have a multi-year, multi-step strategy to get us where we want to get to, but we need a different administration. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you
I
very
think
much.
everybody knows what I mean.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you especially Lauren for preparing a very tailored presentation. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to hearing more from the PRISM and going to the website, and especially that wonderful spreadsheet sheet. I'll look forward to seeing that when it's available.
Hopefully very soon. And thank you so much for having me.
Very much. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.